The ballroom was silent, frozen in shock. Just as Elliot Sinclair, the city's most powerful millionaire, raised his glass to toast his success, his mistress stormed in, pregnant with his child. But before he could react, his wife smiled, revealing her own sonogram. Except her baby wasn't his. He had been played. The Sinclair estate shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, the grand ballroom filled with the rich, the powerful, and the envious. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved seamlessly between clusters of elite guests, balancing trays of expensive champagne and hors d'oeuvres so delicate they could have been mistaken for jewelry. The scent of luxury hung in the air, imported perfumes, aged whiskey, freshly polished marble. It was a night of celebration, a testament to the empire Elliot Sinclair had built with nothing but ruthless ambition and an iron will. Tonight, he wasn't just celebrating his 50th birthday. Tonight, he was reminding everyone that he was at the peak of his power. Elliot stood in the center of it all, the undisputed king of his castle. He was a tall man with sharp, imposing features, silver beginning to streak through his once jet-black hair, his presence commanding in an understated way. His suit, tailored to perfection, bore the signature of an exclusive Italian designer whose name only the wealthiest would recognize. In his hand, a crystal glass, filled not with champagne, but with his preferred 30-year-old scotch, a drink as rich and aged as the life he had meticulously crafted for himself. At his side was Margaret Sinclair, his wife of nearly 2 decades. She was elegance embodied, tall, poised, and draped in an emerald silk gown that skimmed her body with effortless sophistication. Her features were softer than Elliot's, but there was a quiet steel in her eyes, the kind that had kept her by his side through years of social battles and betrayals. She smiled at the guests, played her role as the perfect wife with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. Yet, tonight, something was different. The way she held herself, the way her fingers barely brushed Elliot's when he reached for her hand. There was something unreadable about her, something just beneath the surface that even Elliot, as perceptive as he was, couldn't quite place. He brushed it off. Tonight was a victory lap. The night was moving towards its climax, an extravagant toast, followed by an announcement that would shake the business world. Elliot was preparing to unveil a merger that would solidify his status as one of the most powerful men in the country. He could already picture the headlines, the admiration in the eyes of his peers. Power, control, dominance. These were the things that made Elliot feel alive. As the hour neared, he signaled the staff to dim the lights slightly, drawing the attention of the guests. Conversations died down. Eyes turned toward him. With an easy, confident smile, Elliot lifted his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, carrying just the right amount of arrogance. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating another year. It's about celebrating success, ambition," and the doors to the ballroom slammed open. The sound ricocheted through the room, shattering the polished, curated atmosphere like glass hitting concrete. Every head turned. Every conversation froze. And then she walked in. Jasmine Carter, tall, breathtaking, dressed in a red satin gown that clung to her curves like sin, eyes burning with purpose. She was younger than Margaret by at least 15 years, with waves of dark auburn hair tumbling over her shoulders, her beauty undeniable, even lethal. But it wasn't her presence alone that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. It was the fact that she was pregnant, and she made no effort to hide it. With deliberate steps, Jasmine moved toward the center of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a slow, taunting rhythm. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a challenge as she stopped in front of Elliot, ignoring the shocked whispers around her. Margaret, standing beside her husband, remained frozen in place, her expression unreadable. Jasmine's voice was clear, sharp, and merciless. "I figured this was the perfect time to share some news," she said, letting her fingers graze her stomach before looking up, locking eyes with Elliot. "I'm pregnant," she announced, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. "And Elliot is the father." It was a gunshot in the middle of a symphony. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, sharp inhales. Everywhere, faces turned to Elliot, to Margaret, to the woman who had just destroyed the illusion of the perfect Sinclair marriage in one calculated moment. Elliot didn't move. He didn't blink. The moment stretched too long. Margaret, who had remained perfectly still, finally shifted. And then, she smiled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't even the polite, practiced smile she had perfected over years of playing the dutiful wife. It was genuine. Lifting her chin, she reached behind her chair and pulled out something from her small clutch. A small, folded slip of paper. A sonogram. She held it up, just enough for Jasmine to see. Jasmine's smirk faltered. Margaret turned slightly, her eyes now on Elliot, who was still struggling to process what the hell was happening. "Oh, darling," Margaret said smoothly, tilting her head, her fingers delicately holding the sonogram between them. "You should have told me we were making public announcements tonight." Elliot felt his stomach drop. Margaret placed the sonogram on the table. "It's funny," she mused, "because I also have some wonderful news to share." Pin drop silence. "I'm pregnant too." A sharp inhale from the crowd. Jasmine's expression darkened. Elliot felt the world tilt. Before he could find his voice, before he could ask the only question that mattered, Margaret turned her gaze back to him. And this time, her smile carried something new, something dangerous. "But of course," she added, with the same calm, effortless grace, "the baby isn't yours." Jasmine's lips parted slightly in shock. The guest stared, motionless. Elliot's chest tightened. His mind raced. No. This wasn't happening. Not to him. Not in front of everyone. For the first time in years, decades, Elliot Sinclair felt something he had never truly experienced before. Powerlessness. And across the room, Margaret lifted her glass. "To Elliot," she said, voice smooth as silk. "For once, you're not the one holding all the cards." And then she drank. Elliot couldn't breathe. The whispers exploded into full chaos. And in that moment, as realization crashed over him like a tidal wave, one singular thought gripped Elliot's mind, suffocating him under the weight of its truth. He had been played, at his own game, and it was too late to stop it. If you thought Elliot had control of the situation, think again. What would you do if your entire life unraveled in front of an audience? Tell me in the comments. Is Margaret a mastermind or just seeking revenge? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories full of unexpected twists. The weight of Jasmine's words still hung in the air like thick smoke, suffocating the once celebratory atmosphere of the grand estate. Glasses trembled in hands. The polished perfection of the evening cracked beyond repair. The powerful, the influential, the ones who had come to pay tribute to Elliot Sinclair, the untouchable, now stood frozen, watching him with something close to fascination and horror. There was nothing more intoxicating to the elite than watching a man at the top begin to fall. Jasmine hadn't moved, standing in the middle of the ballroom like a goddess of destruction, her lips curling in satisfaction as she took in Elliot's silence. She had expected a fight. She had expected denial, rage, excuses. Instead, what she got was far more delicious. Elliot Sinclair, for the first time in his life, looked truly stunned. The room had become an organism of whispers. The men, exchanging glances laced with amusement and schadenfreude. The women, their eyes darting between Margaret and Jasmine, hungry for the unraveling of this carefully curated life. And then there was Elliot himself, standing at the epicenter of his own slow-motion implosion. He could feel the judgment, the sharp edges of scandal slicing through his polished existence. But nothing had prepared him for Margaret's smile. She had not recoiled. She had not gasped. She had not broken down in a fit of humiliation or tears, like a woman betrayed was supposed to. No, she had smiled. And worse, she had produced her own sonogram, delivering a revelation that turned his scandal into something far more sinister. Margaret's words had been precise, deliberate, lethal. "I'm pregnant too, but the baby isn't yours." It had detonated like an explosion inside his ribs. The ballroom itself seemed to pulse in reaction, the guests now gorging themselves on the absurdity, the betrayal upon betrayal. Elliot could feel it, his power slipping between his fingers like grains of sand. He had built his empire on control, on dominance, on knowing every move before it was made. But now, standing beneath the gleaming chandeliers of his own home, he felt like a pawn in someone else's game. And then she had lifted her glass. "To Elliot, for once, you're not the one holding all the cards." The burn of scotch in his throat did nothing to dull the sharp blade of realization. Margaret had known. For how long? Weeks? Months? Long enough to orchestrate this. Long enough to plan her revenge with chilling precision. Elliot clenched his jaw, fighting to contain the storm inside him. His vision narrowed, his pulse a hammer against his skull. Across the room, Margaret continued to sip her drink, her face unreadable except for that slight, knowing smirk. Jasmine, still reeling from Margaret's counterattack, had lost her earlier bravado. She had come expecting to deliver a fatal wound, only to find herself equally exposed. And that was when reality began to seep in. Margaret wasn't just announcing another betrayal. She wasn't simply walking away from their marriage. No, this was something far worse, far more calculated. She was tearing down his legacy, brick by brick, making sure he had nowhere to run. He needed to get out of this room. He set his drink down with a sharp, deliberate clink, the sound slicing through the murmurs like a blade. If he lost his composure now, it was over. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, his voice carrying just enough edge to demand attention. "It seems my wife and I have given you quite the spectacle tonight. But let's not allow a personal matter to overshadow an otherwise perfect evening." It was an attempt, a last-ditch effort to restore order, to remind them all that Elliot Sinclair was still Elliot Sinclair. But the damage was done. His words were met with nods and forced smiles, but the eyes betrayed them all. They weren't looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him like a man who had just been dethroned. Margaret's voice was soft, but it carried like a gunshot. "Oh, darling, do you really think we can just carry on?" Elliot's gaze snapped to her. She took a slow step forward, the emerald silk of her gown whispering against the marble. She was enjoying this. After all, isn't transparency one of the cornerstones of business? She mused. "You should be proud, Elliot. We're giving these people exactly what they came for, a show." Laughter rippled through the room, light, elegant, merciless. Margaret turned to Jasmine then, her expression unreadable. Jasmine, who had wanted this moment to be hers alone, now found herself reduced to nothing more than another piece in Margaret's game. "I have to say," Margaret continued, swirling the last of her champagne in her glass, "it was incredibly bold of you to assume you were the only one with secrets." Jasmine's cheeks darkened. For the first time, she looked uncertain. The guests were now devouring every second of this exchange, waiting for the next blow to land. "How long have you known?" Elliot's voice came out low, controlled, but inside, he was burning. Margaret tilted her head. "Long enough," she said simply. And that was the moment he knew. She had been waiting for this. Not reacting, not retaliating. Waiting. She had seen his affair unfolding in real time and let it happen, let him dig his own grave. The realization made his blood turn to ice. "You wanted me to find out this way," he murmured. Margaret's lips curled into something unreadable. Of course. It was so casual, so devastatingly effortless, that it took Elliot a moment to process it. Margaret hadn't just caught him. She had set the stage for his own destruction. Jasmine took a slow step back, finally grasping that she had been nothing more than a piece in a much bigger game. The guests weren't even pretending to hide their interest anymore. The scandal had officially outshined the event itself. Margaret turned back to Elliot, stepping close enough that only he could hear her next words. "You built your empire on power, Elliot," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "You manipulated, you cheated, and you always assumed you were the smartest person in the room." She leaned back, her gaze steady. "How does it feel to be outplayed?" Elliot felt something cold settle in his stomach. Because for the first time in his entire life, he didn't have an answer. The air in the ballroom had thickened into something almost unbearable. The once polished, meticulously controlled environment of Elliot Sinclair's empire had become the stage for a scandal so grand, so orchestrated, that even he, a man who had built his entire existence on power and precision, could feel the walls closing in around him. Margaret had planned this. She had waited, patient as a predator, watching him waltz through his own arrogance as he believed he was untouchable. And now? Now she had flipped the entire chessboard, revealing not just his sins, but her own checkmate. "I'm pregnant too, but the baby isn't yours." Those words rang in his skull, an endless loop of disbelief, betrayal, and something else, something far more dangerous. Because if Margaret had gone to these lengths, this wasn't just about revenge. This was about destruction. Elliot's grip tightened around the edge of the table as he forced himself to remain upright. The gazes of New York's elite bore into him like knives, dissecting him, savoring the rare sight of a king brought to his knees. Some were already whispering. Others had abandoned the pretense entirely and were openly relishing the downfall. Margaret stood with a dangerous elegance, her emerald gown flowing around her like liquid silk, her face a mask of serene amusement. Her fingers traced the rim of her glass as if she had all the time in the world, as if the wreckage of Elliot's reputation wasn't unfolding right before them. And then there was Jasmine Carter, still standing in stunned silence, her previous triumph now crumbling under the weight of Margaret's revelation. Jasmine had planned to be the one who brought Elliot to his knees, but instead, she had become collateral damage in a much grander war. Elliot needed to regain control. Now, taking a slow breath, he let out a measured chuckle, his voice sharp but steady. "You've always had a flair for theatrics, Margaret," he said, forcing the words through his teeth. Margaret lifted a delicate brow. "And you've always had a flair for underestimating me, dear." The room hummed with quiet tension, the kind that made people lean in, eager for the next blow to land. Elliot's eyes locked onto his wife's. He needed answers. He needed to understand how deep this betrayal ran, how long she had been playing this game right under his nose. Who? The question was sharp, direct, laced with barely concealed rage. Margaret took a slow sip of her champagne before placing the glass back on the table, the movement infuriatingly controlled. Does it matter? Elliot felt his stomach twist. He had expected her to gloat, to toy with him, to give him a name just to watch him unravel. But instead, she simply left it hanging in the air, letting the weight of the unknown suffocate him. And that was worse, because it meant that whoever it was, they weren't just a pawn. They were important enough to her that she wasn't even willing to let Elliot use them as a target for his rage. The thought was a knife between his ribs. Margaret tilted her head slightly, observing him like a scientist watching an experiment unfold. "You're panicking," she mused softly, her voice a whisper just for him. "For the first time in your life, you're not the one in control. How does it feel, Elliot?" Elliot clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. He wanted to lash out, to demand answers, to tear through whatever careful plan Margaret had built and reduce it to dust. But that was exactly what she wanted. She wanted him to lose control. So he didn't. Instead, he took another slow sip of his scotch, savoring the burn, and forced a smirk to his lips. "Cute." Margaret smiled in response. "No, Elliot. This." She gestured vaguely around them, to the gasping guests, the shattered illusion of his perfect life. "This is war." Jasmine had heard enough. She wasn't meant to be a bystander in Margaret's victory. She had walked into this room with her own power, her own trump card, and she was not about to let Margaret steal the entire show. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice sharp. "So that's it. You knew about the affair, and you just sat there, waiting to what? Make a dramatic exit? You act like you're in control, Margaret, but you're no different than the rest of us." Margaret turned to Jasmine then, and for the first time, there was real amusement in her expression. "Oh, darling." Jasmine stiffened. Margaret took a slow step closer, her tone softer, almost pitying. "You thought this was about you?" She let out a small, airy laugh. "Sweetheart, you were just convenient." Jasmine's eyes flashed with humiliation and fury. She had expected Margaret to crumble, to be just another wife scorned, another woman discarded in favor of someone younger. But instead, Margaret was devouring her whole. Elliot saw it too. Margaret wasn't just leaving. She was erasing him. Everything he had spent decades building, his reputation, his empire, his carefully cultivated image, she was ripping it apart at the seams. And the worst part? She was doing it with a smile. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, low enough for only her to hear. Margaret's expression softened into something that almost looked like sympathy. "Oh, Elliot," she whispered, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder before leaning in close, her lips barely grazing his ear. "It already is." And then she stepped back, turning her attention back to the guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice as smooth as ever, completely unfazed by the carnage she had just unleashed. "Thank you for a lovely evening. But I do believe my husband has some explaining to do." She turned back to Elliot one last time, lifting her glass in one final, merciless toast. "Happy birthday, darling." And then, Without another word, she walked away. Jasmine looked between them, torn between victory and devastation. Elliot stood frozen, the ground beneath him splitting open, his world crumbling in real time. He had spent his entire life playing this game, and now he had lost. The room hadn't fully recovered from the seismic shift that Margaret had just caused, but Elliot Sinclair didn't have the luxury of standing in shock. He could already feel the aftershocks moving through the crowd, whispers morphing into theories, stolen glances transforming into judgment, alliances quietly shifting in the dim glow of the ballroom chandeliers. Every second that passed was another blow to his empire. Jasmine was still there, standing stiff and unsure, her earlier triumph curdling into something sour. She had expected scandal, fallout, perhaps even the sweet taste of watching Margaret suffer. But this wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had walked into this room intending to claim power, but all she had earned was a front-row seat to Elliot's downfall. And judging by the way Margaret had just glided away from the disaster, unfazed, untouched, unbothered, Jasmine was starting to suspect that she had never really been in control at all. Elliot exhaled sharply through his nose, ignoring the twisting in his gut. His instinct told him to follow Margaret, to demand answers, to break through her maddeningly unshaken composure and pull the truth from her with force. But he knew better. Margaret was no fool. She had planned this moment with surgical precision, and if she was walking away now, it meant she had already anticipated his every reaction. And nothing would be more pathetic than chasing after a woman who had just publicly humiliated him. So instead, he turned to the real threat in the room, the guests. Control. Regain control. He forced his expression into something reassuring, something unbothered, though the effort felt like shoving a mask over a broken face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, smoothly lifting his glass again as if nothing had happened, "I do believe my wife enjoys her theatrics a bit too much. But let's not allow a little family disagreement to ruin such a fine evening." A few guests let out polite, nervous laughter, but it wasn't enough. Elliot could feel it. He had lost the room. The illusion was gone, his untouchability shattered. The moment Margaret had turned her back on him, she had transferred power to herself, and he had to get it back. He didn't wait for a response before swiftly exiting the ballroom, his strides precise, measured, as if he were the one leaving on his own terms. But the moment he stepped out into the quiet corridors of his estate, his carefully controlled breathing fractured. "Margaret." His hands curled into fists at his sides as he made his way up the grand staircase, his mind racing through 100 different possibilities at once. How long had she known? How long had she been planning this? And, more importantly, who was the father? His jaw tightened as he reached their bedroom door, shoving it open without knocking. The room was quiet, dimly lit by the soft glow of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Margaret stood by her vanity, slowly unclasping her diamond earrings, her expression annoyingly calm. She didn't even turn to acknowledge him. "You made quite the scene tonight." Elliot's voice was low, dangerous, though he knew Margaret had seen through his threats years ago. She gave a small, amused hum. "You think so?" Elliot stepped further inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "Who?" That single word carried the weight of everything. Margaret finally turned, her gaze sharp and knowing. Now, Elliot," she murmured, tilting her head. "Is that really what's eating you up the most? Not that I humiliated you in front of every person you respect, not that your mistress just became another pawn in a game she didn't understand, but this? The idea that another man might have taken something that was once yours. Once." That word sliced through him. Margaret had always been his. Their marriage wasn't built on love. It was an empire, a business transaction, one that he had always controlled. But tonight, for the first time, he felt like a man who had been discarded. "Who?" His voice came out tighter, more strained. Margaret just smiled, reaching for the zipper of her gown. "You don't get to demand answers, Elliot." His chest tightened. "The hell I don't." She let out a quiet laugh, the sound filled with something almost pitying. "You still think you have power here, don't you?" She slipped her gown off her shoulders, letting it pool at her feet, leaving her in nothing but black silk lingerie. Unbothered, effortless, untouchable. Elliot stepped forward, invading her space. "I built this life," he said, voice sharp. "Everything you have, everything you are in this world, Margaret, is because of me." She met his gaze without flinching. You built this life, yes. But you made the mistake of thinking I wouldn't outgrow it. His nostrils flared. You're being a fool if you think you can just walk away from me. Margaret lifted a delicate brow. Who said I was walking away? Elliot stilled. What? A slow, knowing smirk curved Margaret's lips. You still don't get it, do you? She took a step closer, her voice soft. I'm not leaving, Elliot. I'm taking. His stomach dropped. She let the silence settle between them, her gaze watching as realization finally dawned in his eyes. She wasn't just dismantling their marriage. She was dismantling him. She was going to take everything. Margaret turned then, retrieving something from her nightstand, a neatly prepared stack of legal documents. She held them out with practiced indifference, waiting for him to take them. Elliot snatched them up, flipping through the pages, his pulse hammering against his skull as he absorbed what he was seeing. Divorce papers, with terms that would leave him gutted. He let out a slow, dark laugh. You think I'll sign this? Margaret's smirk deepened. Oh, Elliot, she murmured. You don't have a choice. He threw the papers onto the dresser, shoving a hand through his hair as he paced, rage threatening to consume him. He had spent his life winning, controlling, making sure that no one ever had the upper hand over him. But Margaret had played him. She had seen his affair with Jasmine, watched him make his arrogant little mistakes, and she had waited. Not to leave him, but to destroy him. And for the first time, Elliot had no countermove. Margaret stepped forward again, this time standing close enough that he could feel her warmth, could see the glint of satisfaction in her emerald eyes. Consider this your final lesson, Elliot, she whispered. You never truly had control. You only had the illusion of it. She turned away, dismissing him without another word, slipping into their en-suite bathroom as if the conversation had never happened. Elliot remained there, fists clenched, the weight of losing everything crashing over him. Margaret was right about one thing. For the first time in his life, he had no power at all. Elliot Sinclair had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of control. He had built his empire on ruthless efficiency, dominating boardrooms, manipulating markets, turning powerful men into obedient followers. His reputation was more than wealth. It was power, fear, admiration. He was the man no one dared to challenge, the man who dictated the rules and ensured the world played by them. But standing in the hollow silence of his private study, staring at the divorce papers Margaret had left behind like a signed death warrant, he felt something foreign creeping into his bones. Helplessness. It was a feeling he refused to acknowledge, one that he fought against with every fiber of his being. He had spent years sculpting the perfect illusion, his marriage, his wealth, his dominance over every aspect of his life. And yet, Margaret had torn through it in a single night, reducing it all to a spectacle for the hungry eyes of their so-called friends and rivals. Elliot dropped into his leather chair, the weight of the evening settling over him like a lead cloak. His fingers traced the rim of his untouched whiskey glass, his mind spinning through endless possibilities. Margaret wasn't simply leaving him. She was dismantling him. She had made her move with the kind of patience and precision that only someone who had been planning for years could manage. How long had she known? How long had she watched, waited, prepared? The thought was infuriating. It wasn't that Elliot cared about love. He had never deluded himself into believing their marriage was built on anything as fragile as emotion. Marriage, to him, had always been a contract, a strategic alliance, a merger between two forces that could strengthen one another. Margaret had played her role flawlessly, elegant, poised, socially untouchable, a woman who elevated his image without ever threatening his authority. Until now. Until the night she turned the game against him. His mind flashed back to the ballroom. The murmurs, the stolen glances, the unspoken judgments from men who once feared him. He had been reduced to a joke in a matter of minutes. And worst of all, he had let it happen. He exhaled sharply, standing abruptly and pacing toward the window. The skyline stretched out before him, the glass panels reflecting the city he once owned. He had ruled this world with an iron grip, and yet, somehow, Margaret had slipped through his fingers. Not just slipped, escaped. His jaw clenched at the thought. No, she hadn't escaped. She had walked away, unscathed, victorious, with a smile that told him she had orchestrated this entire disaster to perfection. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He didn't turn as it opened, already knowing who it was. Jasmine. She entered the room hesitantly, her usual confidence dimmed in the aftermath of Margaret's revelation. The dress she had worn so boldly earlier now felt like a remnant of a war she hadn't won. She had expected to be the center of the scandal, the one who shattered the Sinclair marriage. Instead, she had been reduced to an afterthought, overshadowed by Margaret's masterstroke. "Elliot," she said cautiously, her voice softer than usual. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he downed the rest of his whiskey in one sharp movement before turning to face her. She looked different now, less victorious, more uncertain. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his tone devoid of warmth. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you serious?" She stepped closer, arms crossed. "You think you get to decide that?" Elliot sighed, rubbing his temples. He wasn't in the mood for this. "You don't understand, do you?" His voice was colder now. "This was never about you." Jasmine's lips parted slightly, her hands tightening around her waist as she stared at him, searching for something, a sign that she hadn't just thrown herself into a fire for nothing. "You said we'd be together," she reminded him, her voice sharp with accusation. Elliot let out a low, humorless laugh. "I said a lot of things." Her nostrils flared. "So that's it? That's all this was to you?" He exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "I don't have time for this." Jasmine let out a hollow laugh. "Of course you don't." She had expected betrayal. She had prepared herself for Margaret's reaction, for Elliot's anger, for the storm that was bound to follow her announcement. But she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to feel like a pawn in someone else's war. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again. "She won, didn't she?" Elliot's silence was answer enough. Jasmine took a slow step forward, eyes locked onto his. "So what now?" Elliot stared at her for a long moment, then turned back to the window, as if the city itself could give him an answer. What now? He had spent years crafting an empire that no one could touch. He had believed himself untouchable. And yet, Margaret had found a way to shatter that illusion. But this wasn't over. It couldn't be. Elliot was a strategist. He didn't accept defeat. Margaret had made her move, but he would make his. His fingers curled into fists at his sides as his mind began forming the next step, the next move in a battle he refused to lose. This wasn't just a marriage falling apart. This was war. He turned back to Jasmine, his expression unreadable. "You should leave." Her brows furrowed. "What?" "Go home, Jasmine." His voice was final, dismissive. "You've done enough." Jasmine inhaled sharply, searching his face for any sign of the man she had risked everything for. But she found nothing. Only a man consumed by something bigger than her, something darker than she had anticipated. And so she left. The door clicked shut behind her, and Elliot was alone again. But this time, he wasn't drowning in defeat. He was planning. Margaret thought she had won. She thought she had taken control. But Elliot hadn't survived this long by letting others dictate the rules. He would find out who the father was. He would destroy whoever dared to think they could take what was his. And most importantly, he would take back everything Margaret thought she had stolen. The game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Elliot Sinclair had always believed in one undeniable truth. Everything in life could be controlled. Wealth was control. Power was control. Even people, with the right incentives or pressure, could be controlled. He had built his empire on that foundation, maneuvering through life like a grandmaster playing chess, always 5 moves ahead of everyone else. But tonight, as he sat in the dim glow of his study, his hands gripping the edge of his desk like it was the only thing tethering him to reality, he realized something deeply unsettling. He was the one being played. Margaret had orchestrated everything. Not just her public humiliation of him, not just her announcement, but the deeper, more calculated truth. He no longer knew the rules of the game. The father of her child. That single question burned in his mind, gnawed at the very edges of his sanity. Margaret wasn't reckless. If she had gone to the extent of revealing her pregnancy in front of New York's elite, then she was fully aware of the consequences. Which meant only one thing. Whoever he was important. Elliot wasn't just dealing with a betrayal of the flesh. This was war. He picked up his phone and dialed. The voice on the other end answered almost immediately. "Mr. Sinclair, find out who the father is." A beat of silence. Elliot could hear the quiet tapping of a keyboard, the faint hum of a city in the background. Discreetly, he added, his voice lower now, taut. "Understood." The call ended. Elliot leaned back, exhaling slowly. He didn't need to tell them to be thorough. He only hired the best. By morning, he would have a name. And once he did, he would do what he did best, eliminate threats. The night was long. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's face, that knowing smirk, the satisfaction in her voice when she had told him, in front of the world, that the child wasn't his. He had spent years under the belief that Margaret was a woman who knew her place, a partner in public, an accessory to his success. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, ignored the moments where she had sharpened herself into something lethal. And now, she was the one holding the blade. By dawn, his phone buzzed. A single text message. Daniel Carrington. Elliot froze. For the first time in years, his stomach twisted. Daniel Carrington. Investor. Rising competitor in the market. A man Elliot had once dismissed as an annoyance, a lesser figure in the grand scheme of business. Margaret's child was his. Elliot stood abruptly, his pulse a slow, steady drum of rage. He paced toward the window, looking out over the city he had once controlled so effortlessly. How had this happened? How had Margaret not only defied him, but done it with a man who wasn't even in his league? Or maybe that was exactly why she had chosen him. The thought made Elliot's vision narrow. Margaret had been planning this for a long time. He had always assumed she was content to exist within the world he had built for her, that she accepted the terms of their marriage as easily as a business arrangement. But she had been playing a different game entirely. Daniel Carrington wasn't just some passing distraction. He was leverage. Margaret hadn't just left Elliot. She had secured a future where she wouldn't need him at all. Elliot could feel the rage simmering under his skin, his grip tightening around the phone in his hand. His first instinct was to act, to destroy Daniel, to make sure whatever future he thought he had with Margaret and her child was reduced to ash. But rage wasn't enough. Elliot was not a man who acted without purpose. He wasn't going to throw a punch in the dark and hope it landed. If Margaret wanted a war, then she would get one, but on his terms. He called his investigator back. I want everything on Carrington. Financials, weaknesses, who he's tied to. His voice was measured now, controlled. I want something I can use. I'll have a full report by the afternoon. Good. The call ended, and Elliot exhaled, his mind already moving ahead. He had spent years building a reputation as a man who couldn't be touched, a man who dictated the terms of every engagement. And now Margaret thought she had slipped free. She thought she had outmaneuvered him. She hadn't. Not yet. The first time Elliot saw Daniel Carrington after that night, he understood why Margaret had chosen him. Carrington was younger. That was obvious. Mid-30s, sharp-featured, with the kind of confidence that came from knowing people underestimated him. He had made a name for himself in the financial sector, known for making bold moves, investing in companies on the brink of collapse, and turning them into profitable machines. It was a mockery, really. A man like him thinking he could take what belonged to Elliot Sinclair. Elliot watched him from across the room, a high-profile charity gala filled with New York's wealthiest. He hadn't come here to socialize. He had come here to send a message. Carrington hadn't seen him yet, too preoccupied shaking hands with some board members, his laugh easy, his presence effortless in a way that irritated Elliot. Elliot waited until Carrington was alone, standing at the bar, before making his move. Quite the night, isn't it? Carrington glanced sideways and froze, his grip tightening slightly around his glass. Mr. Sinclair. Elliot smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his own glass. No need for formalities. We're practically family now, aren't we? Carrington didn't flinch, but his posture shifted, shoulders straightening, preparing for whatever battle Elliot had come to start. I was wondering when we'd have this conversation, Carrington admitted, finally turning to face him fully. I assume you have something to say. Elliot took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down on the bar. I don't waste time with threats, Daniel. That's not how I operate. He tilted his head slightly. You see, Margaret has always had a talent for seeing potential in underdogs. Carrington's jaw tightened. Careful. Elliot smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Tell me, do you really think this ends with you and Margaret living happily ever after? He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. Do you think I'll just let you walk away with my wife? With my legacy? Carrington held his gaze. She's not your wife anymore. The words hit harder than they should have. Elliot exhaled sharply through his nose, his fingers tapping once against the bar. I hope you understand what you've walked into, Daniel. Carrington's lips quirked slightly. I understand more than you think." Elliot studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "We'll see." And with that, he walked away, his mind already calculating the next move. This wasn't just about Margaret anymore. This was about winning. Elliot Sinclair had never tasted defeat. He had spent his life conquering, his empire built on the bones of men who had dared to stand in his way. He was ruthless, unshakable, a force of nature in the business world. People feared him, respected him, envied him, but no one ever outmaneuvered him. Until now. Until Margaret. Until Daniel Carrington. The name alone left a bitter taste in his mouth, a reminder that his wife, no, his former wife, had walked away from him with a child that wasn't his. That she had chosen another man, a younger man, over him. That she had spent God knows how long orchestrating the perfect exit, leaving Elliot standing in the wreckage of a marriage he hadn't even realized was burning until it was too late. But this wasn't over. It was never over. Elliot had spent years building his reputation as a man who never lost, and he wasn't about to start now. Margaret thought she had escaped, that she had outplayed him, but she had forgotten one crucial thing. Elliot Sinclair didn't forgive, and he certainly didn't forget. He sat at the head of his private conference table, his fingers tapping against the smooth glass surface. The city skyline stretched out behind him, the twinkling lights of Manhattan casting long shadows across the room. Around him sat his most trusted advisors, his legal team, his top executives, the men and women who had helped him carve out his empire. They were waiting, watching, expecting him to dictate his next move. He didn't disappoint. "We're going to destroy Carrington," Elliot said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying the kind of weight that sent a chill through the room. "I want his company in ruins. I want his investments to fail. I want every deal he touches to collapse beneath him." There was a beat of silence before his chief financial officer cleared his throat. "Sir, Carrington's firm isn't large enough to be a direct threat." Elliot's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a blade. "It's not about business." The CFO swallowed. "Understood." Elliot leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Margaret chose him." His tone was deliberate, biting, asterisk, and that means he's a problem. A very temporary one. His lead attorney, an older man who had cleaned up more of Elliot's messes than he cared to count, spoke carefully. "If you're asking for a legal assault, we can find a way to complicate his financials, drag him through regulatory red tape, slow down his growth, make his investors nervous. But if you want to bury him, it'll take more than a few well-placed lawsuits." Elliot nodded slowly. "Then we don't just take his business. We take everything." The room remained still. No one spoke. They had seen Elliot dismantle men before, had watched as he reduced billionaires to nothing more than desperate relics of their former selves. But this time, there was something personal in his voice, something dark, something far more dangerous. Carrington wouldn't just lose his business. He would lose everything. The first crack in Carrington's foundation came 2 weeks later. A routine audit of his company suddenly spiraled into an IRS investigation, the kind that froze assets and sent investors into a panic. Board members started jumping ship, distancing themselves from a firm that now reeked of instability. One of his biggest pending deals, a merger that would have solidified his presence in the industry, mysteriously fell apart when the other company's CEO was suddenly pulled into a separate SEC probe. None of it was a coincidence. Elliot had mastered the art of sabotage. Carrington was a fighter, that much was clear. He didn't fold immediately, didn't crumble under the pressure like so many others had. But Elliot knew the game better than anyone, knew how to apply pressure in all the right places until even the strongest man broke. And then, the final blow came. A carefully leaked rumor, one that suggested Carrington had engaged in insider trading, that he had made strategic investments based on information he wasn't supposed to have. The media took it and ran, and suddenly, Carrington wasn't just dealing with financial problems. He was dealing with a full-scale public relations nightmare. Elliot watched it all unfold with a kind of cold satisfaction. This was what happened to men who dared to take what wasn't theirs. Margaret wasn't stupid. She had known Elliot long enough to anticipate his retaliation, had likely prepared for it. But even she hadn't expected him to move this quickly, this ruthlessly. The first time she called, he ignored her. The second time, he let her voicemail go unanswered. By the third time, she showed up at his office. Elliot wasn't surprised when his assistant informed him that Margaret Sinclair was waiting in his lobby. He had been expecting this. He took his time finishing his drink, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit, reveling in the fact that for the first time in weeks, he was the one in control again. When he finally stepped out to meet her, she was as composed as ever. She stood in the center of the room, hands folded in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. But he knew her too well. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the sharpness in her gaze. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she said. Elliot smirked. "Immensely." Margaret let out a slow breath, as if steadying herself. "You've made your point. Now stop." Elliot tilted his head slightly, as if considering it. "I don't think I will." Margaret's lips pressed together. "Daniel has nothing to do with this." Elliot let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, Margaret, you of all people should know that's not how this works. You wanted a war. You got one." She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his, unflinching. "I never wanted this." "Bullshit." He leaned in slightly, voice dropping. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You humiliated me. You took my name, my marriage, my reputation, and you made a spectacle of it. And now you want me to play nice." Margaret exhaled, shaking her head. "Daniel doesn't deserve this." Elliot's smirk deepened. "Neither did I." A beat of silence stretched between them. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice softer this time. "Elliot, enough." For a moment, something flickered in his chest. A memory of the woman she had once been, of the partnership they had built together before everything collapsed. But it was gone as quickly as it came. Elliot leaned in, just enough that his breath ghosted against her ear. "No, Margaret. Not yet." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She just studied him, as if searching for something that wasn't there anymore. And then, finally, she turned and walked away. Elliot watched her go, his grip tightening at his sides. This wasn't over. Not until Daniel Carrington was nothing more than a ruined man. Elliot Sinclair sat in his office, the weight of his own downfall pressing down on him like a vice. The city sprawled out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, its golden lights flickering against the dark sky, but he barely noticed. The whiskey in his glass had long gone warm, untouched, as he stared at the scattered documents on his desk. Evidence of the empire he had spent decades building now standing on crumbling foundations. Everything he had done to destroy Daniel Carrington had worked. The man was financially wounded, his company hemorrhaging money, his investors scrambling for safety. But Elliot had expected Margaret to come running back, to realize that Carrington was nothing more than a mistake, that she had bet on the wrong man. Instead, she had held her ground. She had stayed by Carrington's side. And worst of all, she had countered. Elliot prided himself on never being caught off guard, but the envelope sitting in front of him, delivered to his office that afternoon, was something he hadn't seen coming. Inside, a single sheet of paper. One paragraph, meticulously typed, too clinical to be anything but a direct threat. "You've made your move, Elliot. Now it's my turn. If you don't stop your attacks on Daniel, the board of Sinclair Global will be receiving a full report detailing the offshore accounts linked to your private investments. It's over. Walk away before you have nothing left." No signature. No need for one. He knew exactly who had sent it. Margaret. Elliot leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple, exhaling through his nose. She had been waiting for this. All those years by his side. All those years of watching him manipulate markets, strike down competitors, bury scandals before they could breathe. He had assumed she had turned a blind eye, had believed she was too detached from the finer details of his business dealings to ever piece together the truth. But she had known. She had known, and she had waited. Elliot clenched his jaw, forcing his rage down, keeping it in check as his mind scrambled for a countermove. He had been at war before, but never like this. This wasn't business. This was personal. A knock at the door. His assistant peeked inside hesitantly. "Sir, she's here." Elliot didn't react immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, schooling his expression into something neutral. "Send her in." Margaret walked in, composed as ever, draped in a fitted navy dress that was effortlessly elegant, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't here to plead or negotiate. She was here to end things on her terms. Elliot gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Margaret didn't move. "I assume you've read my message," she said. Elliot studied her, waiting for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt. There was none. You think you can threaten me? His voice was calm, but sharp, carrying the weight of barely restrained anger. Margaret tilted her head. I don't need to threaten you, Elliot. I'm giving you a choice. His lips curled into something resembling a smirk, but there was no humor in it. You always were good at pretending you had leverage. Margaret exhaled slowly, then reached into her bag and pulled out a second envelope. She placed it on the desk between them. Elliot didn't touch it. What is this? Margaret crossed her arms. The final nail in your coffin, if you decide to keep going down this path. Elliot's fingers twitched. He grabbed the envelope, opened it, and pulled out the documents inside. His eyes scanned the contents, and then his stomach dropped. Bank statements, transfer records, offshore accounts traced back to him. Proof of financial maneuvering that, if exposed, could not only ruin his business but send him to prison. For the first time in his entire life, Elliot Sinclair was holding something that could actually destroy him. Margaret sat down then, as if she could finally sense the shift in the room, the moment he realized just how deep in the hole he had fallen. You underestimated me, she murmured. Elliot's grip tightened around the papers. His mind spun, calculating, searching for an escape route. He had spent years protecting himself, making sure that no one could ever have anything on him. But Margaret had spent years watching, years collecting, waiting. She had set him up to fail, and he had walked straight into her trap. His lips parted slightly, a bitter laugh escaping. I have to admit, Margaret, I didn't think you had it in you. Margaret tilted her head. That was always your mistake. Elliot closed the folder, exhaling through his nose, tension coiling in his shoulders. She had won. He didn't want to admit it, didn't want to give her that victory, but the truth was staring him in the face. If she leaked these documents, he wouldn't just lose his company, he would lose everything. And Margaret knew it. She leaned forward slightly, her voice lower, softer now. Walk away, Elliot. Stop this war with Daniel. Let it go, or I release everything. Elliot chuckled darkly, shaking his head. You think I'm just going to roll over? Margaret met his gaze. I think you don't have a choice. Silence stretched between them. For the first time in his life, Elliot felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. The ground beneath him wasn't stable anymore. And Margaret? Margaret was the one holding the rope. She stood then, smoothing out her dress. Think it over. She turned, heading for the door, but before she could reach it, Elliot spoke. Why Carrington? Margaret stopped. Her back was to him, but he could see the slight tension in her shoulders. Elliot's voice was quieter now, rougher. Was it just about revenge? Was it just about hurting me? Margaret turned her head slightly, her gaze catching his over her shoulder. There was something unreadable in her expression. It was never about you, Elliot. And then she was gone. Elliot remained sitting there, the weight of her words sinking in. Never about him. For years, he had assumed that everything in Margaret's life, her decisions, her loyalty, her silence, had revolved around him. But the truth was more devastating than any betrayal. Margaret had left long before she actually walked away. She had just been waiting for him to realize it. Elliot stared at the documents in front of him, at the damning proof of his own carelessness, his own arrogance, and for the first time in his entire life, he felt something foreign. Defeat. Elliot Sinclair had always believed that every war could be won. It was just a matter of who was willing to last the longest, hit the hardest, and lose the least. He had spent his life waging battles, against competitors, against investors who doubted him, against men who thought they could outmaneuver him in the boardroom. And he had never lost. Until now. The office felt suffocating, the air thick with something unseen but undeniable. The city outside his windows stretched infinitely, the skyline he had once conquered now feeling unreachable. His name was still written on buildings, on contracts, on the tongues of those who feared and respected him. But for the first time, he felt like a stranger in his own kingdom. Margaret had done this. She had dismantled him with the precision of a master strategist. Every move calculated to weaken him, to pull apart the illusion of power he had spent his life perfecting. He had spent weeks tearing apart Daniel Carrington, expecting that at some point, Margaret would surrender, that she would see there was nothing left for her outside of him. But she hadn't broken. She had done something far worse. She had beaten him. Elliot stared at the documents in front of him, the ones Margaret had sent over earlier that day. Bank records, confidential reports, the kind of evidence that could obliterate a man's reputation, send his empire into a downward spiral, and, if handled correctly, even put him behind bars. He had built an empire on bending the rules, on understanding the loopholes that made men like him invincible. And yet, here it was, proof that he wasn't untouchable at all. A lesser man would panic. A weaker man would run. But Elliot Sinclair had never been weak. His grip on the edge of his desk tightened as he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew what Margaret wanted. She wanted him to fold. She wanted him to accept defeat, to step back, to let her win. But the part of him that had clawed his way to the top, that had survived scandal and betrayal and 100 different battles in the corporate world, refused to go quietly. A knock at the door. His assistant's voice, cautious, uncertain. "Sir, she's here." Elliot didn't respond right away. He let the silence settle, let himself absorb the reality of what was happening. This was it. He nodded once. "Send her in." Margaret stepped into the room like she owned it, and in a way, she did. Not in name, not on paper, but in the way she carried herself, in the way she looked at him, not as an adversary, but as a man who had already lost. She was calm, too calm. Elliot had seen her angry before, had seen her poised and calculated in moments where lesser women would have screamed or broken down. But this was different. There was no anger left. She sat across from him without waiting for an invitation, crossing her legs, folding her hands in her lap. She wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to end it. Elliot took his time, pouring himself a drink, studying her as he took a slow sip of the whiskey that no longer burned like it used to. "So this is how it ends," he murmured. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "This is how it always had to end." His jaw tensed. "You think you've won." Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk, but close enough. "I don't need to think, Elliot. I know." He set the glass down with a controlled movement. "If I sign this, I walk away with nothing." Margaret exhaled softly, like she had been expecting this argument. "You walk away with your company intact. Your assets, your name, everything you claim to care about. I'm giving you a chance to leave with dignity." His laugh was sharp, humorless. "Dignity?" He shook his head. "Tell me, Margaret, when exactly did you decide this? When did you look at me and think, I'm going to burn it all down?" Her gaze held his. "When you thought I would stay no matter what you did." His stomach tightened. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You don't get it, do you? It wasn't about the affairs, Elliot. It wasn't about Jasmine or whatever fleeting distractions you thought you needed. It was about you thinking you could own me, that I was just another part of your empire." Elliot didn't look away. He refused to. Margaret's voice softened, but not in kindness. "But I was never yours." The words struck something deep, something he didn't even want to acknowledge. His fingers drummed against the desk. "And Carrington?" Margaret's expression didn't change. "What about him?" Elliot let out a slow breath, his control slipping just enough for his voice to lower into something dangerous. "You think he's different? You think he's better than me?" Margaret studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. "It was never about better, Elliot. It was about freedom." The word cut deeper than it should have. Freedom. She had never truly been free. Not in their marriage. Not in the life he had built for her. Not in the world he had so carefully constructed, where she had played the perfect wife while he played the untouchable king. But now, she was walking away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Elliot exhaled through his nose, accepting what he didn't want to accept. He picked up the pen, staring at the papers in front of him, the final terms that would strip him of any claim to her, any hold over her life. He could fight. He could drag this through the courts, bury her in legal battles, refuse to give up an inch of ground. But what would that prove? That he was desperate? That she had left him, and all he could do was chase after a battle he had already lost? No. Elliot Sinclair was not a man who clung to a sinking ship. He signed. The moment the ink touched the page, something shifted in the room. Margaret exhaled, her shoulders relaxing, the finality settling between them like the closing act of a play that had gone on far too long. Elliot placed the pen down, forcing himself to meet her gaze one last time. "You were never just a piece of my empire," he said quietly. Margaret's expression softened, but only slightly. "I know." And then she stood, collected the papers, and walked away. The door clicked shut behind her, and Elliot didn't move. The empire was still his. The world outside was still his. But for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do next. The ink had dried, but the weight of what he had done lingered like an ache in his bones. Elliot Sinclair sat in the same chair he had occupied for hours, his elbows resting on the desk, his fingers pressed together as he stared at the divorce papers that now bore his signature. It was over. Not just the marriage. Not just the war. Everything. Margaret was gone. The woman who had stood beside him for 2 decades, who had played the role of the perfect wife in a marriage built on ambition rather than love, had walked away with her freedom and left him sitting in the ruins of his own making. He had fought tooth and nail to keep control, had tried to crush Daniel Carrington, had convinced himself that this wasn't about her, that it was about power. But now, as silence stretched through his office, he could no longer lie to himself. It had always been about Margaret. She had been his greatest asset, the one constant in a life where everything else was expendable, and he had never even realized it. She had played her part so well that he had stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as an extension of himself, a piece of his empire, something that could be controlled, managed, owned. But Margaret had never belonged to him, and now he had to live with that truth. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He didn't look up, his voice low, measured, the mask of composure slipping back into place. "Come in." The door opened, and Jasmine Carter stepped inside, her presence a stark reminder of another mistake, another miscalculation. She was dressed in a sleek, form-fitting black dress, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders in effortless waves. She had always been beautiful, always carried herself with a confidence that had once intrigued him. But now, she looked like a woman who knew she had placed her bets on the wrong man. Elliot sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jasmine." She shut the door behind her, her arms crossing over her chest as she studied him. "So it's official then?" Elliot let out a slow breath, nodding once. "It's done." Jasmine's gaze flickered to the papers on his desk, then back to him. "You don't look like a man who just won." His jaw tensed. "That's because I didn't." A bead of silence stretched between them. Jasmine shifted her weight slightly, her expression unreadable. "So what now?" Elliot exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. "Now," he let out a humorless chuckle. "Now I do what I always do. I rebuild." Jasmine arched a brow, stepping closer. "And Margaret?" His fingers curled into fists against the armrests of his chair. "Margaret made her choice." Jasmine studied him for a long moment, then let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You still don't get it, do you?" Elliot's gaze snapped to hers. "What exactly don't I get?" Jasmine's smirk was almost pitying. "Margaret didn't just leave, Elliot. She won." He clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his sides. "I signed the papers. I let her walk away. That's not losing. That's cutting my losses." Jasmine tilted her head, her voice softer now, almost gentle. "You don't see it. She didn't just take herself out of your life. She took herself out of your world." Elliot frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Jasmine sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It means she was never playing the same game as you, Elliot. You thought this was about power, about revenge, about making sure she knew you were still in control. But Margaret? She was never trying to beat you at your own game." Elliot remained silent, his thoughts spinning, his grip on the arms of his chair tightening. Jasmine took another step forward, her gaze locked onto his. She just wanted to be free. The words hit harder than they should have. Margaret had never wanted to win. She had just wanted out, and he had never seen it coming. His throat felt tight, his pulse a slow, steady thrum in his ears. Jasmine must have seen something flicker across his face because she let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "You don't even know what to do with yourself now, do you?" Elliot forced a smirk, but it felt hollow. "I'll survive." Jasmine studied him for a moment, then scoffed, turning toward the door. "Yeah, I'm sure you will." She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. Elliot watched as the door clicked shut behind her, the weight of the empty room settling around him like a vice. He had built his entire life around the idea that he could shape the world to his will, that people were just pieces in a game only he understood. But Margaret had proved him wrong. She hadn't needed to fight him. She hadn't needed to play dirty. She had simply walked away, and that had been the most devastating move of all. He had spent so much time trying to hold on to power, trying to destroy anyone who threatened his control, trying to ensure that no one ever left him on their own terms. And yet, that's exactly what Margaret had done. She had left, not out of hate, not out of anger, but because she had realized she didn't need him anymore. And Elliot? For the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. He wasn't the kind of man who wallowed in self-pity. He wasn't the kind of man who let emotions consume him. He would rebuild. He would rise again. But the truth was an unshakable weight in the back of his mind, a whisper that refused to be silenced. Margaret hadn't just walked away. She had left him behind. And that was the one thing he could never undo.